Welcome to Module 16. Earlier in this course I told you that keeping your whole application in a single XML file works, but it is not how you build anything real. This is the module where we actually do it. 7 steps in a real Anypoint Studio project. First we look at the mess. Then we create the folders and the configuration files. Then we move things across one at a time. The global elements, then a subflow, then a second flow, then the global error handler, and at the end we look at the finished project. Along the way I will tell you which file each thing belongs in, how to name them, what breaks and what does not, and the tips at the end that stop this going wrong. Step 1. This is where every Mule project starts, and there is nothing wrong with it on day 1. One configuration file holding everything. The connectors are in there, the main flow is in there, the subflows are in there, the error handler is in there. Studio draws all of it in one editor because it all lives in one file, and when you scroll you just keep scrolling. On day 1 this is fine, because you can see everything and nothing is hidden. The trouble arrives quietly around month 3. That file is now 800 lines. 2 developers need to change different flows in the same sprint, and every pull request turns into a merge conflict. Nobody ever decides to write an unmaintainable file. It grows one flow at a time, and this is what it looks like when it has. Step 2. Before you move anything, you need somewhere to put it. Right-click in the Package Explorer, under Source Main Mule and create a folder. Then inside it create a new Mule configuration file. And that second part matters more than people realize. Always use new Mule configuration file. Do not create an XML file by hand, because Studio generates the Mule root element with all the namespace declarations already in place, and without the right namespaces your file will not open in the visual editor, and it will not deploy. Now, an important point about the folders themselves. Mule does not care about them at all. At startup it loads every XML file it finds under source main Mule and merges them into one application, no matter which folders they sit in. The folders are not for the runtime. They exist purely for the human being who opens this project in 6 months. So group by layer or by domain, never by component type. Step 3. And this is the one to do first in any real project, because it is the highest value and the lowest risk. We are moving the global elements, the listener config, the request configs, the global properties. Watch the process, because every other move follows exactly this pattern. Open the Configuration XML tab on the source file, because that is where the truth lies. The canvas you drag components onto is only a drawing of this file. Select the element you want, from its opening tag all the way to its closing tag. It is one complete, self-contained block. Cut it. Open the destination file, put the cursor inside the Mule root element and paste. Save both files. That is the whole operation. And notice what did not happen. Nothing broke. Every config-ref in every other file still points at these connectors, because global element names are application-wide. They are not scoped to the file they are declared in. That is the single most important fact about splitting a Mule project, and it is why this is far safer than it feels the first time you do it. Step 4. The subflow. And it is exactly the same process. Configuration XML. Select from the opening subflow tag to the closing subflow tag. Cut. Open the destination. Paste inside the Mule root. Save both. The reason a subflow earns its own file is reuse. The moment a block of components is called from more than one place, it stops belonging to any single flow and becomes shared logic. And shared logic deserves a home where people can find it. And the same rule applies here. The flow reference that calls this subflow still resolves perfectly, because flow names are global across the whole application. You move text between 2 files. The running application has not changed at all. Step 5. The second flow. Same process again, so I will keep this short. Select the whole flow element, cut, paste into its own configuration file, save. But here is the judgment call worth making. Not every flow needs its own file. The rule I use is that your API layer, the flows an endpoint actually triggers, should be readable on one screen. When a second endpoint arrives and the file starts needing a scroll to take in, that is the moment to split, not before. Splitting a 100-line file into 6 files is not organization, it is just more places to look. Step 6. The global error handler, and this is my favorite one because of what it buys you. Same process. Select the error handler element, cut, paste into its own file, save. What makes this different is what happens afterwards. You now have one named error handler in one file, referenced by every flow in the application. When the error contract changes, and it will, you change it in one place instead of hunting through every flow for a copy of the same handler. And any flow that declares no error handler of its own automatically inherits this one. That is the payoff. Your flows get shorter, and your error behavior becomes consistent by default rather than by discipline. Step 7. The result. Look at the Package Explorer now. Instead of one file holding everything, there is a structure, and you can tell what this application does just by reading the file names. Connectors in their own file, shared logic in its own file, the error handler in its own file, and the main configuration file left holding business logic and nothing else. Each editor now shows one focused set of flows instead of a wall of them. And here's the thing worth saying clearly. Nothing about the deployed application changed. Same flows, same references, same behavior, same deployment. Mule merged every one of those files back into a single application at startup. What changed is that two people can now work in this project at the same time without colliding, and a new person can find things without asking anybody. So which file does a thing belong in? Global config holds connectors and global elements and no flows at all. HTTP configurations, database configurations, object stores, caching strategies, property placeholders. This is the first file anybody opens when something will not connect, so keep it clean. The API file is your interface. One flow per endpoint and almost nothing else. And done well, it reads as a list of flow references. The implementation file holds the private flows that do the actual work, called by the API layer and never exposed directly. Common subflows holds anything used in more than one place, and a rule there is simple. The moment you copy and paste a block of components, it belongs in that file. The global error handler is one named handler inherited by every flow. And configuration lives in a YAML file under resources, with secrets in a secure properties file and never in the XML. If you only ever do two of these, do global config and the API file, because connectors tangled up with business logic and endpoints scattered everywhere are the two things that genuinely hurt. Naming, and here the file names matter every bit as much as the component names. For configuration files, choose names that say what is inside. Global-element.xml or -api.xml, global-error-handler.xml. Do not use mule-config.xml, or flows2.xml, or demo-copy.xml, and never leave a file called test.xml in a real project. For folders, choose a layer or a domain. Global, implement, API, not stuff, not MISC, not new, and definitely not backup, because backup folders end up deployed along with everything else. For flows, start with a verb. Get-order-flow, validate-order-subflow. Not flow 1, not copy of main flow. For global elements, name them for what they connect to, so orders_backend_config rather than the studio default of HTTP_request_configuration1, which tells you nothing, and make the file match its contents. A file called sub-flow-reusable should hold reusable subflows and only those. The principle is that the file name is documentation. Somebody scanning your Package Explorer should be able to guess what this application does without opening anything. And when you rename, do it inside Studio with refactor rename, never by renaming the file on disk, because Studio updates the references for you. So what actually breaks when you split, and what does not? Flow references across files. Nothing breaks, because flow names are global across the whole application and a flow reference finds its target by name, not by file. Config refs across files. Nothing breaks either. A connector declared in one file is referenced happily from another. Transactions. Completely unaffected, and it is worth being precise here. A transaction follows the thread, not the file. A flow reference into another file stays on your thread and joins the transaction normally. That is very different from a sync, which starts its own thread and will not roll back, or a parallel for each, which quietly degrades to sequential inside a transaction. Splitting files has nothing to do with any of that, and the deployed application is identical, because Mule merges every XML file under source main Mule at startup. Now the two things that do break: duplicate names, two flows with the same name, and the application will not start at all. And this is easy to cause because while you are cutting and pasting, it is very simple to leave a copy behind in the original file. Studio flags it in the margin with the message flow name should be unique. If a deployment fails right after a split, look for that before you look anywhere else. And missing namespaces, paste a database select into a file that does not declare the DB namespace and it will not deploy, which is exactly why you create files through new Mule configuration file rather than by hand. So when should you split, and how far? Split when a file passes roughly 300 lines, or when you catch yourself scrolling to find a flow, or the moment two people needed that same file in one sprint. Split the connectors first, because that is the highest value and lowest risk change you can make, since connectors have no dependency on your flows. Do not split when the whole application is 3 flows and 100 lines, because 2 files is fine and 6 would just be ceremony. And do not split while you have uncommitted work. Do it on a clean commit, in its own commit, so the diff stays reviewable. Because a split touches a lot of lines and you do not want real changes hiding in it. How many files? 4 to 6 for a normal API. Fewer than 3 usually means connectors are still mixed in. More than 10 and the split has itself become the problem. How deep? 1 folder level. Start flat and add a folder when a layer earns 1, because a folder holding a single file helps nobody. And one more thing that comes up constantly. If you need 4 or 5 values, do not chain 4 or 5 set variables. That is 5 components to read and 5 to maintain. Build them all in one transform message with data weave. 1 or 2 values, set variable is perfectly fine. 3 or more, switch. To recap the whole module, a flow is one XML element, so moving it is a cut and a paste and nothing more. Names are global, which is why references survive the move and why duplicates kill startup. Always create files with new Mule configuration file, so the namespaces come with them. Mule ignores folders entirely, so they exist for people, not the runtime. And do the split in its own commit. The questions an interviewer will ask. Does splitting change the deployed application? No. Can a flow reference call a flow in another file? Yes, because names are global. And what is the most common failure right after a split? A duplicate flow name left behind in the old file. Thanks for watching.